Hello, everybody. Welcome everyone to this CCI webinar. Over the last 1 year, ever since the lockdown has started and the COVID wave has started, and even before that, CCI webinars have been very popular among all the pulmonologists. And to begin with, I would just introduce myself. I am Dr. Jayalakshmi TK. I am Senior Consultant Pulmonologist at Apollo Hospitals, Navi Mumbai. I was ex-head of department at DY Patil Hospital prior to this, and I'm a pass out from KEM Hospital and Nair Hospital at Mumbai. And I would like to say first speak few words about CCI and then go on to introduce our panelists for the day. And as you all are aware, CCI is a group which started in 2014 and with one single WhatsApp group. It was founded by none other than Dr. Krishna, who is really famous and very popular and very loved among all the pulmonologists for having given them a platform where they can not only express themselves but also they can communicate with the other pulmonologists, learn so much by way of sharing so many publications, presentations, difficult cases. So it's really like a family. And though there are many who don't actively participate, everybody reads and understands and knows all their colleagues through the CCI group. I would also thank Dr. Narendra, who is the current president, Dr. Ravi Doshi, who is the current secretary, for having given us the opportunity here to be part of this webinar today. So I would like to start by introducing our panelists. So I would like to introduce first Dr. Pratik Kaushik. So he is from Chhattisgarh. He's done a lot of work in COVID. He is the COVID chief, intensive care, ECMO, and ward he manages. He has been trained in UK. He was earlier at Leeds. He left UK in 2009 to come to India, and he is an MBBS DTCD state head of CCI as well as CG Chess Society and the HOD of his hospital, and doing extensive work in the ICU, in the critical care among COVID patients. So welcome, Dr. Pratik Kaushik.
Thank you.
Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Ankit Rathi. He is a young pulmonologist, from Jodhpur. Earlier, he was working at Delhi and Noida. He is MBBS and MD from KLE Belgaum and IDCCM from Delhi. And he worked for for about a year in Mumbai as well in Global Hospital. And now he is heading his own pulmonary critical care unit. And welcome to Dr. Ankit Rathi.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. I would next like to introduce Dr. Shweta Gargia. She is a young female pulmonologist. She is a DNB pulmonology, IDCCM, having her own ICU, running her own COVID intensive care unit in Ahmedabad, Gujarat, and working as a pulmonologist and as an intensivist. So has been doing a lot of work during the COVID era as well. And welcome to Dr. Shweta. Yeah. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Dr. Pramod Jhawar. He is MBBS, DTCD, FCCP, consultant chest physician, bronchoscopist, sleep disorder specialist, and he's the director of his own chest center, Jhawar Chest Center at Indore. He's a bronchoscopist as well as intensive care and running his own intensive care unit at Indore. So welcome to Dr. Pramod Jhawar.
Thank you, madam.
Yeah,
Thank
hello.
you so much, madam.
So thank you so much to all our panelists for being part today and being part of our presentation today. So what we will do today is we will start by making, I have a brief presentation which I'll be making. It's about 10 minutes on just to summarize what is there in anticoagulants in COVID as of now. And we will follow it up by questions to our panelists, and then we will be taking the questions from the audience. So we will start with my presentation now, which will be brief, just to outline the topic. So I'll be talking about anticoagulants in COVID-19. Mechanism of anticoagulants in COVID. Main thing is that COVID induces complement hyperactivation, endothelial dysfunction, cytokine storms. All these have a pro-thrombotic effect. COVID-19 patients are seen to have a severe pro-coagulative state, and it is related directly to the disease severity. In critical patients, thrombotic lesions in the microvessels have a prevalence twice as higher than in the than in critical non-COVID patients, and hence anticoagulant treatment was suggested for COVID. What is the coagulopathy in COVID-19? So we have a mild thrombocytopenia, mild elevation of prothrombin time, elevated fibrinogen, elevated D-dimer, increased risk of thrombosis. This is seen in practically all the patients of COVID. Some patients have, very few patients have overt disseminated intravascular coagulopathy type with hyperfibrinolytic or bleeding phenotype. This is rare. So endothelitis is postulated to be a central feature of the pathophysiology. The SARS-CoV binds to host cells via the ACE2 receptors. ACE2 receptors are found more in the endothelial cells. So the autopsy evidence for this is a prospective studies done in Germany as well as in Italy, and it compared and it found that there were 7 by 12 patients had unsuspected bilateral distal vein thrombosis. 4 by 7 died from PE, and 6 out of 9 had fresh thrombi in the prostatic venous plexus in men. So this was seen in the autopsy studies. The thromboinflammation or coagulation is mediated by various mechanisms as seen here. And the laboratory markers are D-dimer, fibrinogen, C-reactive protein, ESR, ferritin. The Virchow's triad shows the vascular endotheliitis, platelet activation, viral provoked by the viral RNA, DNA, fractal 11A, thrombin, and endothelial dysfunction and altered blood flow. So these three things form the Virchow's triad in COVID-19, increasing the chances for getting a thrombus. And the increased risk is seen in patients with venous or arterial thrombosis, disseminated intravascular coagulation, advanced age, recent surgery, cancer, pregnancy, infection, chronic inflammation, liver disease, renal disease, and thrombolytic therapy. So trials awaiting the results. These are the mega trials which are going on, ATT, ACC, Active4, REMAP-CAP, and these are multi-center big trials which are awaiting the results of anticoagulation and the effect on COVID-19. So as of now, the studies which are there are smaller studies, and the evidence is yet not a very full-fledged evidence to recommend one way or the other about anticoagulation. But most of the evidence shows that giving a prophylactic anticoagulant for an admitted patient will be worthwhile. So we will go on to the some of the guidelines. So I'll discuss in brief about the NIH guidelines, which was in February 2021. So it says for non-hospitalized patients, no data to support either measurement of D-dimer, fibrinogen, or platelet count. In hospitalized patients, hemat and coagulation factors are measured. No data for recommendation for or against. Chronic anticoagulation therapy, you have to continue pre-existing anticoagulants. For VT, prophylaxis and screening is only clinically indicated, same as in non-COVID patients. Guideline for anticoagulants is none for non-hospitalized. For hospitalized non-pregnant adults, we should give prophylactic dose. Higher than prophylactic dose for VT is not recommended. Should not be discharged on VT prophylaxis. Continued anticoagulation can be considered for those at low risk for bleeding and high risk for VTE, as per the protocols for those patients without COVID. There is insufficient data for routine screening of VTE, and for hospitalized patients with rapid deterioration, consider underlying thrombotic episode and treat accordingly. For children, same as those for children without COVID-19. So same guidelines to follow. For treatment, if there is a suspected PT or thrombotic disease, manage with a therapeutic dose. Those who require ECMO or CRRT or who have thrombosis of catheters or extracorporeal filters should be treated with antithrombotic therapy as per standard protocols. In pregnancy and lactation, if antithrombotic therapy is prescribed prior to COVID, this has to be continued. For pregnant patients hospitalized with COVID, anticoagulation is recommended unless it is contraindicated for other specific reasons. VT prophylaxis after hospital discharge is not recommended. During labor and delivery, anticoagulants to be used as in non-COVID patients. Ultrafiltrated heparin, low molecular weight heparin, warfarin do not accumulate in breast milk, can be used in lactating mothers. NOACs are not recommended in lactating mothers due to lack of safety data. Association between COVID-19 and thromboembolism, it is associated with inflammation. Elevation in these markers show worse outcomes. 14.1% was the VT prevalence in one meta-analysis of hospitalized patients, which is much more than seen in non-COVID patients. Meta-analysis comparing the odds of bleeding and thrombotic outcomes versus intermediate or therapeutic dose anticoagulation, overall odds of VT and mortality are not different. In critically ill, higher dose anticoagulants have a lower incidence of pulmonary thromboembolism but higher risk of bleeding. Incidence of VT is 0.6 at 30 to 42 days after hospital discharge. So this incidence of VT has been reported of 0.6% 30 to 42 days after hospital discharge. Whether this is sufficient to give a prophylactic VT prophylaxis for all patients, that is not concluded. So the special recommendations are for chronic anticoagulants or antiplatelet therapy. If they are receiving warfarin, if they have mechanical heart valve, atrial fibrillation or APLA, they should continue the warfarin. Hospitalized patients taking anticoagulants or antiplatelet therapy should continue the same therapy. OPD patients should not be initiated with anticoagulants. Patients highly suspect or proven to have a thromboembolic disease, treat with therapeutic anticoagulation as in non-COVID patients. Advice on discharge, no VT prophylaxis after discharge is recommended by NIH, except for those with the risk factors, that is reduced mobility, bleeding risk, other underlying conditions. Trials improve modified prevention registry on VT if risk for more than 4 and modified improved VT risk more than 2 and D-dimer more than 2 times upper limit of normal has been tried. So for these patients, whether we should give a VT prophylaxis is a advice. So this is the improved risk score of patients who have a prior thromboembolism, diagnosed thrombophilia, current lower limb paralysis, current cancer, immobilized for at least 7 days, stay in ICU or coronary care, more than 6 years old. So if it's more than 4 or if it's more than 2 with a D-dimer more than twice normal, we could consider a prophylactic anticoagulants. So now we have, when we consider anticoagulants in COVID, we have the following options. One is low dose versus high dose, whether we are giving prophylactic or whether we are giving therapeutic. Preventive is enoxaparin 40 mg once daily, heparin 5000 units every 8 hourly or 6 hourly. Therapeutic doses enoxaparin 1 mg per kg twice daily or 0.5 mg per kg twice daily or heparin infusion 1000 units per hour. And we have to see depending on whether it's an ICU, non-ICU or OPD setting. So these are the various protocols, just summing up. The AIMS protocol, anticoagulation advises use in mild and moderate disease in hospitalized patients only. In moderate cases, you use conventional dose, unfractionated heparin or low molecular weight heparin after ruling out the contraindications or high risk of bleeding. In severe or ICU patients, weight-based intermediate dose prophylaxis is advised. Lab monitoring is with CRP, D-dimer, CBC, LFT, RFT and IL-6. We have an Apollo protocol as well. It says to start the prophylactic anticoagulation with low molecular weight heparin for all admitted patients. The dose is the same standard dose. If the rising D-dimer is there, or if it is more than 6 times normal, it suggests a DVT or P. In such cases, start a therapeutic anticoagulation. Confirm it with the venous Doppler or a CTPA. Prolonged EPDT is not a contraindication to anticoagulants. Repeat PT, platelet count and D-dimer every 2 to 3 days in patients who don't show improvement. At discharge, consider starting patients at high risk with a modified improved score more than 4 or score more than 2 with D-dimer more than 2 times upper limit on DVT prophylaxis, that is rivaroxaban or equivalent. CME India guidelines on anticoagulation. All admitted patients should receive prophylactic dose of anticoagulants as long as there is no contraindication. Decision on anticoagulants need to take into account risk of thrombosis and bleeding. NIH does not recommend routine. However, FDA has approved the direct anticoagulants, that is rivaroxaban, 31 to 39 days, and extended post-hospital VTE studies should be considered in patients up to 45 days. So this has been recommended as per the Magellan, Apex, and the Mariner studies. According to CME India guidelines, it is reasonable to employ the individual risk stratification. Options are 2.5 of apixaban, rivaroxaban 10 mg once daily, enoxaparin subcutaneous. When risk of thrombosis is high, as assessed by the ISTH SIC score, and bleeding risk is ruled out, as assessed by the Hasbled score, we would recommend therapeutic anticoagulation. high Hasbled score more than 3 indicates need for regular review but does not contraindicate the anticoagulation. Individualized post-discharge VT recommendations is recommended. So what is this ISTH DIC scoring system? It is for seeing the risk of thrombosis. So if a platelet count is low, APTT is prolonged, fibrinogen less than 100, D-dimer 0.5 to 1 is 1 point, 1 to 2 points, and total over DIC 5 points and more than 3 points by KSTH. So this is the scoring system. This is the Hasbled score to see the risk of bleeding, the references. So basically so now we will go on to the question and answers and the panel discussion. Thank you. So hello all of you. So we just went over that brief outline, and now I would like to go on. I will start with some of the questions to our panelists. So starting with Dr. Pratik Kaushik. So we saw the NIH guideline. So could you throw some light also on the BTS guideline, what they have to say on anticoagulants?
Actually, the BTS guidelines are in complete collusion with the NIH guidelines. They do not show any sort of difference, except then one point which was a bit confusion, that all the young people and adults who were treated at home, who required just oxygen therapy, if the requirement for oxygen has increased to HFN or NIV or invasive ventilation, then they have recommended to tone down the dose of anticoagulants. They want to see for the other factors of deterioration rather than go for thrombolysis. Otherwise, all the things are exactly the same as NIH has mentioned.
So in deteriorating patient, they have suggested that not to increase the anticoagulation, but instead to look for the other factors. Otherwise, it is similar as the NIH guidelines.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Pratik. And to Dr. Ankit. So considering the low molecular weight heparins, enoxaparin, dalteparin, and fondaparinux, and so what would be your, is there any difference between any of these low molecular weight heparins, and is there any preference for any of them to be used?
No preference as such, but we commonly, all the guidelines recommend a low molecular weight heparin, easy dosing, and can be given easily twice dosing or single dosing if thromboprophylaxis is needed. Unfractionated heparin is considered when there is compromised renal functions or patient is in ICU, very critical, then we need to keep a track of his bleeding tendencies also. If patient bleeds, then we can we can give protamine and can reverse the action of anticoagulants easily, as compared to low molecular weight heparin which have a 24-hour action. So regarding fondaparinux, mostly it is used when we consider either a heparin-induced thrombocytopenia or if there is renal compromise.
Okay. And for if it is a proven embolism, like a pulmonary thromboembolism, so if thrombolysis is being considered, it's not strictly as a part of anticoagulation, but which would you consider?
Unfractionated heparin will be considered first now, because when we are thrombolizing, mostly the unfractionated heparin as an IV can be continued, like IV infusion, and once the thrombolysis is done, it can be restarted. We have better control when unfractionated heparin is given, because it can be again reversed, and also the duration of action is only 4 hours.
And what about the agent for thrombolysis? Any specifications on that or any preferences?
So we have alteplase and tenecteplase. So alteplase is naturally occurring plasminogen activator, whereas your tenecteplase is man-made, which has 3 amino acid substitutions. tenecteplase. Tenecteplase is better as compared to alteplase because it has more fibrin specificity, and also when we see it has more resistance towards degradation in the body. So when there are the like plasminogen inhibitor factors are there, so they try to degrade alteplase much faster as compared to tenecteplase, which is resistant to it. So clot fibrolysis can be better achieved by tenecteplase. Moreover, tenecteplase has better half-life of 20 minutes as compared to alteplase, which is only few seconds, a few minutes.
Okay. So, and what is the cost difference between the two? Are you aware of that?
Yeah, cost difference is there between alteplase and tenecteplase. Tenecteplase in the market, which is commonly used nowadays, comes.
Voice is breaking a bit.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello.
So let's move on to the next question to Dr. Shweta. So, Dr. Shweta.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello.
Hello. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, we'll move on to Dr. Pramod Jawar. Okay, Dr. Jawar, how would you explain the pathophysiology of increased clotting in COVID patients?
As you know, yes, it is a very good question to start with.
Dr. Pramod Jawar, am I audible to you?
Yeah, madam. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Madam, as we know, this SARS-CoV-2.
Hello.
Am I audible? Yes. Madam, as you know, this SARS-CoV-2 virus has been starting its passage from the nose and goes to the throat and then to the alveoli. Where through this.
Have we lost connectivity? Am I audible?
Yeah, madam. Yeah.
Hello.
So, yes, madam. No. Okay. Voice is clear to all of Ankit ji?
Yes, sir. You are absolutely clear.
So this SARS-CoV-2 virus, when it goes to the alveoli, it goes from this alveolar effusions to the these lymphocytes and to get into the endothelial cells of the pulmonary arteriosus, ACE2 receptors, where it's going to injure this endothelial layer and causing the fibrin to be deposited, and there is a microthrombus formation, platelet aggregation.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, madam. And there is a formation of thrombus basically, and it is just going to cause ventilation perfusion defects and causing more of the respiratory symptoms, dyspnea and all. And later on, there may be the cytokine storms and maybe various multi-organ get affected. So you see that there are so many factors are in the picture. Like there may be some of the risk factors, like those patients on the prolonged illness, some of the COPD, chronic disease, liver
connection
injuries.
issue hai kya? I'm not there. What has happened? Is there a connection issue? Hello.
Pratik ji, आवाज आ रही है मेरी?
Hello.
हाँ सर, you're clear.
Madam का
is there some connectivity issue? Not able to.
And there may be some hemostatic abnormality like pulmonary macrothrombi, intravascular coagulopathy, myocardial injuries, and increased cardiac markers, and they may be reflected in the form of D-dimer increase over and FDPS and prothrombin time. They may be platelet rise or lower down. So in an early initial phase, you may get the lymphopenia, maybe inflammatory markers like cytokines, increase IL-6 and increase CRP levels. So this clinical outcome may be in a various way, the pulmonary thromboembolism, myocardial infarctions, and disseminated intravascular coagulations. So these are the various cascades of this pathophysiology when it is going to enter into the alveolar and the different areas in the brain. मैडम आपका म्यूटेड है मैडम, आपकी आवाज डॉक्टर जयलक्ष्मी जी आपका शायद म्यूट है, आप अनम्यूट कीजिए अपने आप को। डॉक्टर श्वेता, आपको आवाज आ रही है? श्वेता जी, आपको आवाज आ रही है?
Yes sir, I can get the voice.
Okay.
Can hear you.
मैडम आप म्यूट हो, आप अनम्यूट कीजिए। Yes, madam.
Hello.
Yes, madam. Now we are able to hear you. So we have just completed how the pathophysiology of the SARS-CoV-2 virus enter into the alveoli and going to the different endothelial injuries and platelet aggregation and clot formation, macrothrombus, and how this is going to affect the different part also into the arterial endothelial layers where ACE2 inhibitors get blocked in the cardiac endothelial arteries and it is going to produce as the so many its effect like there's a dysregulations of these receptors and causing cytokine storms and affecting the various parts of the myocardium. Sometimes it gets atrial fibrillation. It may reflect in the form of STD changes. Sometimes in a severe form, you also get the cardiac tamponade. So there's a various cardiac involvement when it is into the these receptors at the AC2 in the cardiac endothelials. So there's a vast course to the multi-organ failure from not only respiratory cardiac, but also there.
Hello.
Yes, madam.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
ma'am.
Yeah. So Dr. Shweta.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so back to the question which we had asked you regarding anticoagulants in special situations. So everybody is worried about pregnant ladies, lactating mothers. So what are the anticoagulants that can be used for these patients?
Ma'am, for the pregnant females as well as the lactating mothers, the guidelines remains the same as for any normal person. Like, if the patient is not hospitalized, then there is no requirement of any anticoagulation as such. If the patient is hospitalized and having moderate to severe disease, then LMWH is the most preferred anticoagulation which should be used both in the pregnant female as well as lactating mothers.
Okay, so there's no fear of it crossing through the breast milk and
No. LMWH does not cross the breast milk, so there is no fear to the child as such.
okay. And what about warfarin in these patients?
Warfarin usually should not be used in the first trimester of pregnancy because of some developmental disorders which can happen because of the crossing of the placental barrier. So LMWH or UFH is preferred over warfarin in cases of pregnancy.
Okay, and what about NOACs in these patients?
There is no safety data for the usage of NOACs in such group of patients. So they have not been used because of the safety issues. We are not having any safety data for the usage.
And what about patients with special conditions like a patient is there with renal failure or raised creatinine? So what would be the preferred anticoagulant or preventive therapy in these admits? Suppose they were admitted in the ward, what would be the preferred anticoagulant of choice?
Ma'am, in renal failure cases, LMWH again is preferred. We can use dalteparin in dalteparin is much more commonly used over enoxaparin because there is clearance issues in the case of renal failure. So the accumulation of dalteparin is lesser in comparison to enoxaparin. So dalteparin is preferred over enoxaparin in case of renal failure cases.
Okay. And what about hepatic failure? Suppose there is a patient with a pre-existing hepatic condition and raised, say, bilirubin more than 5 or just raised bilirubin enzyme. So what would be the preferred? Is there any?
Ma'am, in cases of hepatic failure, since there is the secretions of the coagulation factors are affected. So there may be a prolongation of the APTT and PT in cases of hepatic failure. So we have to keep a monitoring on the INR in those cases. If the INR is between 2 and 3, or if it is more than 3, then if it is more than 3, there is no requirement of any anticoagulation. And in cases lesser than 3, LMWH can be used.
And is there any lower limit of platelets beyond which you should not try to anticoagulate?
Usually the limit what the guideline says is around 25,000. If the platelet count is less than 25,000, then anticoagulation should be avoided, seeing to the risk of bleeding and thromboembolism.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Shweta. So coming back to Dr. Pratik. So, Dr. Pratik, how often, like when we know that we have OPD patients, admitted patients, we often advise them to do a CBC, CRP, D-dimer. So how often should the D-dimer be tested in these patients? Should they be tested at all in the OPD patients? And what about the frequency in the indoor? And what is the level of D-dimer beyond which you try to alter your treatment?
As far as the OPD patients are concerned, a proper clinical examination and the history, detailed history taking should give us a fair bit of idea whether the patient has a thrombotic phenomena going in the body or is predisposed to thrombosis. In that case, we can get a baseline D-dimer or saturation level done. Otherwise, it is not required in the OPD basis. In indoor cases, after baseline.
So how do you do in your practice? Like we know that theoretically is not required, like not to do. But would you ask for a basic blood profile in a patient who is presenting in the OPD? You are probably doing a phone consultation for these patients. So you will have a detailed history, but there may not be much of clinical examination or anything, because many times mild patients tend to do a phone consultation, or that's practically what I see. So how do you...
To be very honest, practically I do not go for phone consultations. I ask my patients to come over to my OPD and let me examine them clinically, have a detailed history, and then I go ahead with the prescription.
Okay.
So
would you ask for a baseline? Do you ask for a baseline blood examination?
It all depends on the symptoms of the. Most of the patients who are coming to OPD, 95% or a bit more patients they just require reassurance and guidance. They do not require any investigations to be done. By getting over investigating, I don't think so. I'm doing any benefit to either the patient or to the medical science. But few patients who are more than 60, who have some pre-existing comorbidities, then yes, I would definitely require a baseline complete hemogram, baseline D-dimer, CRP levels. Yes, for that cases, I do go ahead with these baseline tests. As far as the IPD patients are concerned, in those cases, after the baseline investigations and depending upon how the patient is progressing, since I require them to undergo a D-dimer level every 48 hours, every second day.
Okay.
If there is no worsening of his hypoxia or clinical, there is no clinical deterioration. As such, D-dimer levels at the baseline will give me a fair bit of idea that whether the patient has propensity to develop some sinister thrombotic pathology or not. But a sequential D-dimer level measurement will not be a guide to increase the dose of thrombolytic therapy. I don't think that is too irrational in my opinion.
Suppose a middle-aged person comes with comorbidity, diabetes, with a history of, say, heart disease. He's already on ecosprin or clopidogrel usually. He is a little obese, but he's maintaining saturation and you're planning to home quarantine him. So you do a baseline blood test for him and you find a D-dimer of raised D-dimer, like more than 2 times normal, more than 3 times normal. So what would you do for this patient?
I would continue with the same ecosprin or clopidogrel to be continued, and just ask him to get a D-dimer repeat after say 2 days or after 3 days, and watch for give him the red flag signals of deterioration and monitor from there. As such, rising D-dimer levels will not warrant me to increase the dose of whether it's ecosprin or clopidogrel or change it out to low molecular weight heparin. Yes, but if D-dimer level at the start is raised by more than 4 times, then I would switch off them to subcutaneous low molecular weight heparin as per the creatinine urine and as per their body weight. That is what I do.
So if they are at home being quarantined, it may be difficult for them to take the subcutaneous. Would you consider giving a NOAC? So this is a question which is a lot of patients also come and ask that the D-dimer is high. So should their blood thinner be started? Because different people advise different things. So
I have used NOACs, but ecosprin has given me the same amount of result with what NOACs have given. So I leave it to the cardiologist to decide upon whether we should shift them to NOACs or not.
Okay. Okay. So we will discuss about ecosprin a little later. And coming to Dr. Pramod Jhawar. So you have told us about the pathophysiology of thromboembolism. Can you share some of the data what we are seeing of the incidence of DVT in patients with COVID and the incidence of thromboembolic episodes in these patients? Dr. Jhawar, what is the data which is there currently?
Madam, there is one study from this level of the D-dimer and the mortality from the Yuan studies, and they have concluded with 191 patients were there, were then examined. There amongst the 135 patients discharged, and around 54% they died over. And among they found that those patients having the more D-dimer range, they have died earlier, and they have the more these prolonged admissions to the hospital stay. And there's a more organ failure to the patient's life. And apart from there's so many studies that come over like incidence of thrombosis and COVID. The allotment, I'm just going to name a few of the studies there. There is because initially it was found that the most of death in the COVID is because of the thrombosis. And first time the various guidelines from the CHEST and the American College of Society and thrombosis sepsis, all guidelines promoted the use of the anticoagulants in the patient with the severe or hospitalized patient with the COVID-19. And so the first study was from the Netherlands. I'm just enumerating the one of the studies. These are more than 100 numbers. This studies was 184 ICU patient has been taken. They have given the prophylactic as well as intermediate dosages and they found that among the given dosages, this original cumulative incidence was venous thromboembolism and arterial thromboembolism was around 27%. And updated cumulative incidence of around venous thrombosis and was around 49%. So the use number was around 49%, where has been one of the studies from the Helms et al. From the France. There's a prospective cohort trial, 150 patients for ICU, in which they used prophylactic 70% therapeutic 13. They also around 18.7% patients had been found to have the venous thromboembolic phenomenon. Another study from France, from Poissy et al., they also confined the same around 20.4. And there's a study.
There's about 20% incidence of DVT in these patients in mild to moderate cases.
Yes, madam. Because
in severe patients?
Severe, it is more than 49.5. So amongst two patients, one is going to get the complications. So there's a huge data to support the use of this data. One a very big study, retrospective cohort trial from Italy. This Lorgi Geni et al. Has been proven. They have also taken 388 patients from the ICU, 16%, and regular award patient 84%. They also use the prophylactic and intermediate or therapeutic 100% in ICU and 75% in ward. They also cumulative rates of around DVT venous thromboembolisms and arterial thromboembolisms and around 21% patients. So
in the critical care, care subgroup, it was about 71%.
Yeah. So these all patients in the ICU requiring larger therapeutic retrospective trial to use of anticoagulants early into the therapies to prevent the complications of the thrombosis and all. major events like.
And have the studies shown any benefit of the intermediate or higher dosage anticoagulants versus the prophylactic dosage anticoagulants?
Madam, this study does not enumerate it like that, but we know that when you are using high dosage, the chances of the bleeding chances are very high if it is monitored. But there's an occurrence of venous thromboembolisms in approximately in 20% patients, and with the cumulative incidence of 49% during this hospitalization. Hospitalized patients are having much more propensity to get thromboembolism rather than the OPD patients. So this proves that the anticoagulants have definitely role.
Yes, definitely. The incidence of DVT is definitely much higher, and so is the incidence of stroke, myocardial infarctions, and pulmonary thromboembolism. Yeah. So, how much higher is it compared to that in a normal hospitalized patient, a COVID patient?
They say those patients who are hospitalized having the more chances, the higher chances rather than the OPD based or moderate diseases. So we know that 55% are asymptomatic or mild symptomatic, but among that moderate to severe patient, the 5 to 15% patients are there, which requires a larger amount of oxygen, looking to their severity of the lung involvement, and their patient class of patient are also going to get much more cytokine storms and much more thrombosis and much more multi-organ, and maybe because of ACE2 receptors into the cardiac and also in the respiratory, the bind, and there's a dysregulation of this receptors and causing the cytokine storm, and mostly affecting the cardiac. You see there's a myocarditis, which is maybe different ECG findings. Enzymes are very less. You may have some arrhythmia in the cardiac involvement. Some may have the diastolic dysfunction, and ejection fraction is also reduced. And some patient, the severe patient having the cardiac tamponade, and patient may be presented with the acute. So cardiac involvement look to be very essential to examine the patient in COVID in a sort of.
Right. So moving on, I think we can move on to some of the audience questions. Not able to really. So we've got several questions from the audience in the chat, and I think we shall now move on to the questions from the audience. Dr. Indu Kiran from Jharkhand, Hazaribagh, has asked if the patient is asymptomatic but D-dimer level is high, what is the guideline to start and stop anticoagulants? So I will ask Dr. Shweta to answer this question.
Ma'am, for the home, like the patients who are not hospitalized, the guideline does not recommend for the usage of the anticoagulations. For the high D-dimer level, we can keep a watch on the D-dimer levels and repeat the D-dimer levels after 48 hours.
Right. Suppose they are asymptomatic.
The guideline does not recommend for the usage of the anticoagulants if the patient is having mild to moderate disease at home.
Right. Right. So the answer to the question is that there is no real recommendation to start any anticoagulants for the asymptomatic patients, irrespective of the D-dimer level. Yeah. So as Dr. Pratik also just explained how he would monitor his patients, if at all it's very high, you see clinically and repeat it after 2 to 3 days and see correlated with the clinical symptoms which the patient is having. And if the patient has a moderate disease, then you would go on to admit the patient and start them on lower molecular weight heparins. But an independent high D-dimer will not have any value in starting an anticoagulant. So that would be the answer. And Muniza Puducherry from Puducherry, Dr. Muniza is asking, what is the intermediate dose enoxaparin? So I would ask Dr. Ankit Rathi about the intermediate dose enoxaparin. So there's a low dose.
So there is a low dose enoxaparin which is used for thromboprophylaxis, which is generally fixed dose or weight based. We use fixed dose in form of like Lexane 0.4, enoxaparin 0.4 subcutaneous once daily. That is for thromboprophylaxis. Then there is a high dose which is full dose full dose enoxaparin, which is 0.6 subcutaneous twice daily. And we are in between. It has been found that can we reduce the risk of bleeding and come into a moderate intensity anticoagulant. So that will be around 0.4, double the dose of standard thromboprophylactic dose, that is 0.4 subcutaneous twice daily. So that will be an intermediate dose. There are ongoing trials to see the efficacy and bleeding risk with it. We might get the answer whether it is sufficient to do intermediate dose by, I think, July, when the trial results come.
Yes, the big studies results are awaited by June, July, and then we should get much more answers regarding this. But I hope this answers your question.
I would like
Dr.
to put in one more point here, ma'am.
Yes.
For intermediate dosage, the patient should be either on a high flow oxygen or should be on an IV or a mandatory mechanical ventilation. We cannot use the intermediate dosage for a patient who's inpatient and just requires low dose.
Yes, so it's not for mild patients. It's only for moderate to severe group of patients.
Moderate.
Yes. Coming on to the next question, Dr. Apurva Verma from Chhattisgarh has asked this question to Dr. Kaushik. So, which is a better, rivaroxaban or dabigatran? The question is to Dr. Pratik Kaushik. Yeah.
Again, going by if I behave like a herd mentality in Chhattisgarh or in most of the dabigatran and other NOACs has been used quite profoundly. But in my personal experience, I would still go ahead with Ecosprin, which also had a added advantage of stopping the virus replication and prostaglandin synthesis inhibition. So that gives me an added advantage on a personal
So I would differ from you here because really Ecosprin, there are no studies to support that, and we have not been using in our center. So anyway, we'll move on to the next question. Dr. Sarvesh Saxena from Uttar Pradesh has asked from Lucknow city, what is the duration of giving antithrombotics in COVID patients? So what is the duration to give this? So who would like to answer, Dr. Pratik?
Ma'am, 14 days it is said that it should be given, and that is what I usually stick to. Minimum 2 weeks of duration if the patient is hospitalized. As far as the OPD patient is concerned, I give and if they require anticoagulation, I'll monitor them on every weekly basis and progress further. So, but in a hospitalized patient, minimum for 14 days, it has to be given, or at least few days after discharge, if at all there has been some thrombotic event.
Yeah, anybody else would like to add a comment? Dr. Shweta?
Ma'am, the guideline says that it should be given for 31 to 39 days. We have a scoring system which we just saw in the presentation, IMPROVE study. Like it's a risk factor. If the score is more than 4, or if the score is more than 2 and the D-dimer is more than 2 times the normal limits, then we can give the anticoagulation for 31 to 39 days. It can be extended for up to 45 days. But in my per se practice, I do extend the anticoagulation up till 3 months if required. If the patient is at high risk of VTE, then we may extend it up to 3 months also.
So basically here it becomes little individualized. The patient's condition, that is whether he is immobile, whether other risk factors are there for thromboembolism, severity of the illness, all these things also come into play, as we are seeing in the other guidelines as well. But so that there is no clear-cut answer for this, how long the prophylaxis will be continued. But for the moderate to severe patients, where we are considering based on the IMPROVE scale or on the D-dimer and the other risk factors, you could continue for a month, that is 31 days. 4 weeks is as per the Apollo guidelines says 4 weeks. And the NIH guideline does not give any particular, but they said you can use for 31 to 39 days, depending on the IMPROVE scale. So that is the answer. And I would also like to announce that Dr. Krishna has also requested that we have reached a live audience here of 1,458, which is a huge record for the CCI. So thank you, the audience, for joining in. And this is a very important topic because we are using it daily and a lot of questions in our mind. So we'll try to cover as many questions as possible. Dr. Somasundaram K. From Tamil Nadu. Is it necessary that anticoagulant should be started in mild cases where D-dimer is more than 2 times? So we have already answered this question that we will not start anticoagulants in mild cases which are not admitted. Only for indoor admitted patients it will be given. And Dr. Shiv Shankar is asked, what are the antidotes of the anticoagulants commonly used in COVID-19? So who would like to take this question?
So I will take it now. So we commonly use either unfractionated heparin or low molecular weight heparin. Unfractionated heparin very well its antidote is protamine sulfate. Low molecular weight heparin also protamine sulfate is used, but it has lesser efficacy as compared to unfractionated heparin. Regarding NOACs, when we talk of dabigatran, apixaban, and rivaroxaban, so dabigatran is our thrombin inhibitor, direct thrombin inhibitor, and the antidote which is used for dabigatran is adalimumab, which is FDA approved, and it depends on the dosage used. Mostly we use 5 gram IV. Whether it is available in India or not, I don't know. But there has been a trial in NEGM which was published, and it gives adalimumab as the answer. Second one is for anti-10A inhibitors like apixaban and rivaroxaban. We commonly use adnexet alpha, which is the molecule which has been given us, which is the antidote for these anti-10A inhibitors. The dosing mostly is dependent on whether low dose is used or high dose of these anti-10A inhibitors have been used. It is mostly used as an IV bolus and followed by an IV infusion. So when a patient is on NOAC and immediate or urgent surgery is required, we can use these inhibitors, antidotes, and patient can be put on an IV bolus followed by an infusion, and an operative procedure can be carried out.
Thank you, Dr. Ratti. So we'll move on to the next question. Dr. Soumyadeep Ghosh, West Bengal, Kolkata. What is the indication for anticoagulant therapy post-discharge? I think we just discussed it. Dr. Shrikanta Rao, Dr. Swadesh Mohanty from Himachal Pradesh. Which oral anticoagulants is better to prescribe in discharge patients, rivaroxaban or apixaban?
The guideline says it to be rivaroxaban 10 mg/OD. Apixaban can also be used 2.5 twice a day, but the guideline recommends rivaroxaban.
I think both can be used. I think they are equivalent.
The only issue I think is cost, which should be considered between these two molecules.
Okay, which is cheaper?
Rivaroxaban is far cheaper than apixaban.
But even in the rivaroxaban, we want Xarelto is very costly. We use the cheaper brand, generic brand. Like sometimes for the poor patient, it is very costly.
Okay, so how much does it work out to? You have idea for the cost?
For rivaroxaban, if you use Camerev or something like that from Alembic, it will cost around 12-15 rupees a tablet. But for apixaban, it can cost up to 100 rupees per tablet. So there is a massive difference between the two.
Okay. So Dr. Kiran has asked from Bangalore that there is a 20% risk for VT in mild to moderate patients also. So what is the consensus recommendation in home isolated patients? Many moderately severe patients are also at home due to lack of beds. Would you still stick by your recommendation of no anticoagulant in home isolated patients? Who would like to answer?
Ma'am, in moderate to severe disease patients who are forced to be at home because of the lack of the beds, in those cases, we should start with the anticoagulation, even though the patient is at home. But if the patient is having mild to moderate disease, then we can wait before starting the anticoagulation, leading to the clinical condition of the patient.
So I think if the patient requires admission, if the bed is not there and they are being managed at home with oxygen and with all their medications, then we would follow the same guideline as what we would follow in a hospitalized patient. We'll treat it as a moderately severe patient and not as a mild patient. So we would give the anticoagulants at home. Low molecular weight heparin can be given, and as soon as they get the bed, they would be hospitalized. So for home, because they are moderately severe, they are requiring oxygen, the D-dimer is high, so they fit into the criteria of moderately severe. They are at home only because they are not getting bed. They're probably receiving oxygen at home. So then the criteria is totally different, because you are treating them as similar to the hospitalized patient. So next question from Dr. Prasanna Kumar, Karnataka, Bangalore. Secondary HLH showing thrombocytopenia, that is the HIT syndrome, anticoagulation of choice. So Dr. Ankit, would you like to answer? If it is
in HIT, we are not using unfractionated heparin and low molecular weight heparin. These two are out. So we'll be shifting to either a NOAC or most preferable Fondaparinux.
Fondaparinux, that is the most preferable for this subgroup. Yes. Dr. Vinay from Uttar Pradesh, should statins be used along with anticoagulants, middle-aged or elderly, if already not on? So statins not typically anticoagulant therapy. Anybody would like to comment? So we will not go into detail about the statin, because it is not strictly an anticoagulant therapy. Whether it is to be used in COVID or not, there are some studies which are there showing some benefit, but it is not as an anticoagulant. So we will move on to the next question. Dr. Jitendra Kumar Dayalal Shah, when to consider apixaban in patients, in home patients? So would you consider a NOAC in a home patient? Is there any circumstance when you would consider? And after discharge, how long would you continue the apixaban?
I think it's the same with what we have told. Whether we are using a NOAC or a LMWH, it doesn't make a difference. So it's the same, guidelines remain the same.
Okay, so Dr. Prajay Lunia from Maharashtra is asking, if D-dimer between 500 to 1000, what is the cutoff to start? Is a 500 a cutoff, or is 1000 a cutoff?
The D-dimer levels alone does not matter. It is the clinical condition of the patient which is to be seen, rather than just saying a single rise in D-dimer.
Yes, because we are differentiating as mild, moderate, and severe, and then deciding the anticoagulant as per that, not on the D-dimer, except while on discharging, when we are trying to see if it's a high risk and fitting into the improve criteria or not. So what is the normal range of D-dimer? Dr. Bandaru Raman Kumar has asked.
Every lab has a different cutoff. Like some labs have up to 500. Some have 0.5. It all depends on your unit and the lab parameters.
So one thing I would also like to mention here is, in a pregnant person, they will always have a very high D-dimer. So in pregnancy, we should not consider the D-dimer at all. Because I had 2-3 references from even gynecologists earlier in the course of the pandemic, and they would be referred for a high D-dimer, and with COVID. So what is to be done? Whether anything need to be done? So in pregnancy, we cannot go by the D-dimer level. It will be high by default. It will be more than 2 to 4 times normal, and it has not to be considered. So that is one thing. And if post-discharge patient is not on anticoagulants, has come for follow-up, and the D-dimer is 2500. Say you have called the patient for follow-up, you have not discharged on anticoagulant, and the D-dimer is 2500. What would you do? Dr. Ankit or Dr. Pratik?
We have to first evaluate the patient, see the clinical picture. That is more important than the D-dimer value. If clinical picture is good, patient is okay, there is no problem, there is no oxygen requirement, he is not desaturating, then why to just start anything on just a report?
We will ignore the D-dimer value if clinically it does not fit in. Okay.
Treat the patient, not the report.
Treat the patient, not the report. This is absolutely correct. So on these days when we are getting WhatsApp, doctor, I have sent you reports. Please see and advise what to do. So yeah. So, how to monitor Eliquis? Should we monitor it? If the patient is on NOAC, what is to be monitored? Dr. Jhawar or Dr. Pratik? So, a patient is on NOAC. So, is there any monitoring need to be done for this patient?
As such, ma'am, it is not required to monitor. NOACs have a very good bioavailability, and actually continuous monitoring is not recommended for NOACs.
Okay.
If you really want to monitor for something, then you can get the drug levels done or anti-factor 10 level done.
So no monitoring. Dr. Shrija Nair from Maharashtra, she's asked, if a patient is already on clopidogrel or aspirin, do you also give anticoagulants? Or can we give NOACs also if the patient is being treated at home? So patient who is already on anticoagulants, already on clopidogrel aspirin, I would like to add a corollary to this question. If patient is admitted and we are giving low molecular weight heparin, patient is already on clopidogrel and aspirin, would you continue all three?
Yes, we would continue with all the three.
So basically the pre-existing medication need to be continued. You make a decision on low molecular weight heparin in the hospital or NOAC after discharge. Yes. Dr. Madan from Rajasthan is asked, I am post-COVID patient. Throughout COVID period, saturation was maintained. Do I need to take an anticoagulant? So no need to take anticoagulant. Dr. Nilesh Bantia has asked for the role of antiplatelets. So this is very critical question. Many people are asking whether the patient need to be started on aspirin, clopidogrel, whether it is enough to start these two. Dr. Pratik has told us his views that he finds aspirin to be equally beneficial. I would like the others on the panel all also to give their comment.
Ma'am, I would like to add to this that though the guideline says that antiplatelets do not have any role, and even there are studies which shows that antiplatelets do not have any mortality benefit. But in my personal experience, we do add antiplatelets in the treatment, even for home treatment and hospitalized patients. And we have seen difference between both the categories of patients.
Okay, Dr. Ankit?
Yes, ma'am. It's the same. Antiplatelets are generally added. If the patient is already on that medicine, it has to be continued. Otherwise, they can be added. Generally for severe COVID patients who are having severe COVID coagulopathy, on discharge at home, we can add a NOAC plus and low dose antiplatelet also. It works very well, although not in guidelines, but personal experiences are good.
Dr. Jhawar?
Madam, mine personal view is that those patient already been on aspirin and clopidogrel, they should be continued, and you have to add on because they are not in the guidelines. But we see the very good result when it is added. Like only the drawback is sometimes patient aspirin induce bleeding. There may be catastrophic sometimes, and therefore the aspirin high dosages should be avoided to such patient when
the panel says that they personally would like to give, but the guidelines they don't recommend, and there is no even the other guidelines, that is the Apollo guideline or the AIMS guideline, none of them have mentioned anything about the ecosprin or clopidogrel as an anti-clotting agent. So it stands like that. Probably when we get more evidence, we will be able to comment categorically on this. And how early can we start anticoagulants? Main pathology, Dr. M. Venkatramana from Telangana has asked, Nizamabad. The main pathology is it's a procoagulant state. So can we really start anticoagulants very early? If we are starting, how early can we start? Dr. Pramod Jhawar?
Madam, as soon as the patient is coming in the severe disease, like when the oxygen is dropping down and there is inflammatory markers on high SID dimers and LDL, ferritin, and patient is having and this class of patient must be initiated as early as possible to start with the low molecular weight heparin or this enoxaparin drugs. And early is the better, because when the patient is in the cytokine storms and there's a multi-organ failure, then it is not then a prophylactic, then it is like a therapeutic dosage you require. So early is better.
It's better to start early in moderate patients. So generally all admitted patients is started early, and OPD patients who are being managed at home, we are not generally starting. And these patients, we are seeing it to to it that they are not hypoxic. And hypoxia may not be just resting saturation, also see the hypoxia when the patient is walking. So ask the patient to walk after exertion, check the hypoxia. That is also considered as a hypoxia. So that really widens the indication for admission and similarly for the anticoagulants. Because if there is hypoxia, it means there is a significant process going on inside the lung, which may be a thrombotic process.
Yeah.
Okay. And so about vaccination, should we take the anticoagulants? So far we have not covered any vaccination questions. So after COVID vaccination, particularly the Covishield, there has been a small increase in the risk of thromboembolic episodes. Especially cerebral venous thrombosis and others. So the question pertains to that, should we start anticoagulant? Dr. Suresh Chandra Upadhyay, Madhya Pradesh, and others also have asked whether after vaccination you should start anticoagulants. Who would like to take the question?
No recommendation at present regarding that. Like you mentioned, ma'am, central venous thrombosis. That also doesn't recommend anticoagulants. There have been many other treatments which have been tried in this.
Yes.
Like
So
IgGs.
I would like to say that the incidence of these clots are very, very minor, considering the huge number of population which is being vaccinated, and is very marginally higher than that in general population. And definitely no anticoagulants are recommended after vaccination, nor are any D-dimer levels recommended after vaccination. You don't have to go, nor before vaccination. You don't have to check D-dimer before, after. So this is not to be done. So Dr. Kamlesh Shah has asked, is the D-dimer report, can it be erroneous? It cannot, sometimes it doesn't correlate with the CT scan score. CT score may show 16/25, but D-dimer is not based. So how do you do, and what do you do in such a situation?
Well, ma'am, they won't correlate well. It is perfectly all right. It's not that if your CT score is high, your D-dimer level should also be high. But in lab errors, D-dimer levels can be erroneous many times.
They can be fluctuating. So even morning, evening levels may be different. So you have to take a serial D-dimer score really to have a value of it. And also you see the severity of the patient based on hypoxia, not only on the D-dimer, to start the low molecular weight heparin. So recommendation for low molecular weight and ecosprin in children. Dr. Kamlesh Shah from Gujarat, Jamnagar is asked, so what about children with COVID?
Ma'am, it is the same as for adults. It is the same as for adults.
Okay, so there's no separate recommendation in children as of now. Most of the children have mild illness. If they do have moderate illness, you treat them, give them low molecular, just change the dose as per their body weight. And so post-COVID patient is already on clopidogrel 75. After COVID, should the dose be increased? Dr. Pramod Jawar?
Madam, already those patients who are having the coronary artery disease, hypertension, already be on some of the medication like antiplatelet and dual clopidogrel aspirin. They should be continued on the same dosages, because as soon as the inflammation goes away, then there is no need to increase the further doses of the
same dose to be continued.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jawar. Dr. Vishal Verma from Punjab is asked, on 6-minute walk test, how much decrease in saturation is significant?
4%.
4%. So the answer is 4% reduction in saturation is significant. And 4% reduction. And is there any absolute value which you are seeing? Suppose baseline is 96, you see 4%. But suppose, is there any absolute value which is significant?
Or is just static value will be, ma'am, 94% saturation, what we see regularly, and we can get an ABG done to document hypoxemia.
Yeah. So basically 4% saturation. Normally the saturation should not decrease after walking. People's saturation remain the same. It should just remain the same, or maybe slight increase also. If it's decreasing, it means there is some interstitial process going on. So 4% would be the significant cutoff. Dr. Anurag Mondal from West Bengal is asked, patient with COVID came with saturation of 55% with hemiplegia. He is diagnosed as hemorrhagic stroke. What are the recommendations on anticoagulants? Anybody would like to take the question? Dr. Ankit? So I would say that if it's a hemorrhagic stroke, we cannot give an anticoagulant because the anticoagulants will lead to further bleeding and worsen the stroke. So at present, that will be one of the contraindications for anticoagulants. Dr. Balveer Chaudhary from Rajasthan, post-COVID patient has a PT of 18.8, INR of 1.4, D-dimer of 1890. Patient is on tablet dabigatran since last 1 year already. Is there any add-on required for post-COVID anticoagulation, or should one continue the tablet dabigatran? So D-dimer is high. He was already on dabigatran, but now has developed COVID. And what would you do? Dr. Shweta.
You can switch over to LMWH because the recommended INR is between 2 to 2.5 for COVID patients.
So he has asked for post-COVID anticoagulation. I would say probably when admitted, we would probably give LMWH, but on discharge, we can continue the dabigatran.
With the dabigatran.
We can continue with dabigatran and go to full dose of dabigatran if he is not taking that.
Sorry?
We can increase the dose to dabigatran to maximum. Dabigatran 150 milligram twice daily if he is having suboptimal dosing.
Okay. Dr. Keval Krishna from Bathinda. My experience is there is persistent fever after 7th day and one of the parameters is rising CRP or D-dimer. Should we start steroids and anticoagulants then? So the patient is having fever after 7 days, but no hypoxia, does not typically fit into moderate, but only persistent fever. So the D-dimer is high, CRP is high. Persist rising. So would you start anticoagulant in the patient who does not typically fit into moderate case because there's no hypoxia?
We would start with steroid at least. If steroids, and in my own personal practice, I would start with antiplatelet.
So Dr. Shweta says antiplatelet. There's no really guidelines on this because all are for moderate. And only for the fever, even there is no guideline for steroid unless there is hypoxia. But in personal experience, practically, I'm sure the panelists and even I myself have seen that if you start a low dose of steroid, for the persistent high fever with the high raised CRP and raised D-dimer, it does have a response. But it is not indicated to be given as per the guideline unless the person is hypoxic or even hypoxic after exercise or maybe a significant CT score and lung involvement on the CT scan. So here it's a personalized opinion and there is no guideline supporting that.
The question was about post-discharge patient.
Persistent fever after 7th day with the rising CRP, not mentioned as a post-discharge.
I think this patient may be the inner cytokine storm source of because it is a 7-day increased CRP level. He's having the fever. So a low dose steroid may be going to help him. He's hypoxic also. So I think
if person is worsening, in spite not hypoxia but worsening fever, worsening clinical condition, you treat it as a moderate patient, admit and treat accordingly.
Yeah.
And how should we change from LMWH to NOAC? So how do you change? Dr. M. Venkatramana from Telangana is asked. So Dr. Pratik would like to answer. Dr. Ankit, how would you transition between NOAC or between warfarin NOAC, heparin NOAC?
So between NOACs and LMWH, ma'am, it is very easy. Whenever the next dose is due, you change the molecule. For LMWH also, whenever the next dose is due, you give a NOAC on that dose of LMWH. For unfractionated heparin to a NOAC, we wait for a duration after the infusion has stopped. We wait for a duration of 30 minutes to 2 hours, and then we can start on. We can give a dose of NOAC. For warfarin and NOAC, we have to wait for if we are transferring from warfarin to NOAC, anti-10A inhibitors like dabigatran, like rivaroxaban or apixaban, then we need to bridge it between with a LMWH. So what we do is we give a warfarin, and after that we bridge it for anticoagulation with LMWH, so that the duration when the INR comes down, and once the INR is below 2.52, then we can start on with the NOAC and stop LMWH for that.
Okay. Thank you, Ankit. Dr. Vishal Verma, suppose a person is having a 4% decrease in saturation, but no symptoms. So this is what we call as a happy hypoxia. They are not symptomatic, but they are hypoxic. So is it significant?
Yes, madam, it is clinically significant. We have to take action.
We have to take action, even though the person is feeling fine, but the saturation is low. We will have to treat it as a moderate case and mild to moderate case and admit the patient. Dr. Pooja Gupta from Madhya Pradesh, if CRP is 38 within 5 days of COVID, should we start steroids? So I don't think it is part of our anticoagulant. So we will not. Dr. Abhishek Chandra has we'll move on to next question. Dr. Abhishek Chandra from Uttar Pradesh has asked, COVID positive patient presents with hemoptysis, mild. How to proceed for investigations, and how can we give low molecular weight heparin in these patients? So the patient is presented with hemoptysis. Who would like to take this question? Dr. Pratik?
Ma'am, the patient is having mild hemoptysis. First, we need to go with the basic investigations. Get a chest X-ray done.
Yes.
And check for whether there is a this is due to the low molecular weight heparin that we have started with, or it is due to the disease which is already
COVID itself can also cause.
In that case, if it's mild hemoptysis, I would not. I would continue with the same medicine, and I would not reduce the dose. But if it is massive hemoptysis or moderate amount of hemoptysis, then yes, I will give it a break and reassess the patient, try to control the hemoptysis, and then treat him accordingly, rather than just stopping the dose with the first watch of blood and reducing all the antithrombotic physiology what we try to create.
Yeah. So sometimes the intense hacking cough can also cause a mild hemoptysis. So we have to see clinically. If it's a persistent hemoptysis, definitely it's a contraindication for giving blood thinning medication, and we cannot give.
Now, madam, many patients are coming with when the immediate moderate to severe patient, they are coming with the hemoptysis mild, because every patient, I think out of 10, 2 patients complain there is a blood into the sputum like. And then the things become difficult. How, whether it is a way to use a prophylactic dose of or way to stop the anticoagulant therapy. This is also clinically sometimes problematic.
It's a difficult decision, but if there is an active hemoptysis, we would not prefer to give a low molecular weight heparin. Yes. And we have to monitor with the D-dimer and see clinically how the patient is doing. But it would be a contraindication. Dr. Nirav Patel, again asking whether to start anticoagulant in children, when to start. So the guideline, we already answered the question, same as in adults. And multiple questions are there about pediatric COVID infection. How would you use anticoagulants? So are low molecular weight heparin preferred, warfarin is preferred, or NOACs are preferred? Dr. Ankit?
So, ma'am, in NOACs, I couldn't find any data regarding that.
It's not recommended in children as of now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Warfarin, we know we have control over it. We can monitor it. We can get PTINR done. So that would be a better choice, I think.
Or it would be low molecular weight heparins.
Yes, and but the child has to get those injections.
Yes.
That would be helpful.
Yes, yes. What is the Dr. Amulya from Karnataka, Bangalore has asked, what is the criteria to start anticoagulation in Cat A cases? Category A, mild or asymptomatic and home quarantine.
As such, it is not recommended to start anticoagulation in the mild category home quarantine patients.
Yes. Which is the preferred anticoagulant in patient at discharge?
Rivaroxaban.
So we already answered that question. Either rivaroxaban or apixaban. And in CKD patients, which is the anticoagulant you would use? What would be the dose and what would be the duration? Dr. Shweta?
Ma'am, in CKD patients, the fragment is much more better than enoxaparin. The lower limit is 5,000 units once a day. It can be increased to 5,000 units twice a day.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Shweta. And up to what level of platelet? We have covered that. Up to 25,000 level of platelet, we can give the anticoagulants. Okay. What are the characteristics of DIC? What are the characteristics of DIC? How would you diagnose DIC in these patients? DIC?
DIC is not a common feature of this COVID-19, but some patient may in advanced cases maybe be presented with, then the subsectionated this fibrogen level can be examined, and apart from the patient may be in a septic shock and sometimes ecchymosis and low platelet count. And I think patient must be evaluated very carefully in a COVID era for sake of this diagnosis.
Right. So we have to watch for it and look out for it, but we don't see it commonly in the initial mild to moderate cases. In the later on severe patients along with sepsis, we may find a DIC. So I think we have covered most of the questions. And one last question. Dr. Raghu Raj from West Bengal has asked, day 5, D-dimer is 1, saturation is 92 to 94. Should we admit and start anticoagulants?
This can be considered as moderate disease since the patient is desaturating. The saturation is coming between 92 to 94%, 98 risk.
Yes.
So we may think of admitting the patient and starting with the antibiotics.
Yes, definitely. And Dr. Ashish Kumar Sinha from Odisha has asked, D-dimer, does it have a diagnostic value or does it have a prognostic value?
It has a prognostic value rather than a diagnostic value.
Yes, absolutely. So single high or low value is not so significant, but how it increases, that will be more significant, or whether it is coming down. When you have admitted patient, started patient on prophylactic low molecular weight heparin, how long do we continue the low molecular weight heparin? Patient may be admitted for a little prolonged period of time, but how long should we continue the low molecular weight heparin? Is there any particular duration? 7 days? Suppose patient is stable, improving, you're waiting for the 10 days to get over before discharge criteria are met. So how many days would you actually give the low molecular weight heparin?
So we will generally consider shifting from a low molecular weight heparin to oral dose after 5 to 7 days of initial low molecular weight injections. So if patient is stable and not worsening, then we can do very well. We can very well do that in hospital also after 5 to 7 days of LMW.
It can be converted in the hospital as well.
Even we see the these proven cases of pulmonary embolism, we only give for 5 to 7 days and going to shift to the oral as soon as the patient gets stabilized and no any hypoxia, no any multi-organ.
Unless they are becoming severe and going into critical, then in that case it will be continued in moderate dose or higher dose. So I think we are coming to the end of our panel discussion. It's 9:30. And I really would like to thank the audience who has participated so well and asked so many questions and given all of us an opportunity to answer. It was great being with you. I would like to thank Dr. Pratik Kaushik, Dr. Ankit Rathi, Dr. Shweta, and Dr. Pramod Jawar for the excellent answers and which you have provided. And I would like to profusely thank CIPLA team for being part of us, Mr. Puneet, Mr. Yadav, for having coordinated the session so well, and for making this platform visible for so many of our live audience. And I would like to thank CCI, Dr. Krishna, all the CCI office bearers for again creating this platform and giving us a chance to speak. Would the panelists like to say anything? Closing comments?
I would like to thank all the CCI working committee, Dr. Krishna sir, and all the CCI academic forum, which is being last so many years coming in the big way to spread the individual identity. As a young chess, I'm seeing Shweta for the first time. Ankit Rathi is also very good into the academics. I'm also meeting my friend Pratik Kaushik after a long time. This is also not only academic floor, but to come up the newer young chess and to get more into the academics and sharing their performance.
So I would like to thank Krishna sir for pushing us and including us in this webinar and giving us an opportunity to express ourselves, and also long live CCI.
And also not to lessen Dr. Ravi Doshi, who's my hero here in MP, not only MP in the India, is doing great work.
Dr. Shweta, any comments?
I would like to thank you, ma'am, for conducting such a great session, first of all.
Yes,
And then I would like to thank Dr. Krishna as well as Dr. Ravi Doshi to give such a good platform to us to express ourselves and to have such a healthy discussion on the most hot favorite topic of this era.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Shweta.
I would like to just thank. Yes, ma'am. I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart to give me a patient ear for all my blabbering, despite my little bit of knowledge. Thank you, CCI. Thank you, the office bearers. Thank you, Dr. Krishna, for giving me the platform to interact with all the stalwarts and the young blood in this forum. And as we were saying on the WhatsApp last night, CCI answers all. So if the answers we are not getting anywhere, we will definitely get the answers on CCI. Thank you once again.
Thank you all.
Thank you.